Okay, and video number 2 of talking about how to approach making Star Wars sequels. And left off talking about how the first 6 movies do form a complete story. So the main question in making a sequel trilogy would be, how do you make it so that it feels like a natural third act in a trilogy of trilogies, since that's what you would have then, a trilogy of trilogies. Now, the most obvious way, the easiest way of having that kind of consistency would be to, well, bring Palpatine back, right? So you would have the same conflict with the same villain. And uh, so that would keep that main through line going, but it would also be stupid and anticlimactic. I mean, you can kind of imagine our heroes being like, "Yay, we did it! We won! We beat him! Yay, yay, yay!" Oh, he's back. Well, nuts. Yo, Luke, stop kissing your sister and get over here. It looks like Palpatine's a slasher movie villain. Yeah, that wouldn't work. Right? Um, yeah, of course they tried doing something like that with the Dark Empire comics back in the day. I don't know how that was received. I imagine it was rather mixed. I don't know, but it certainly wouldn't work in a movie trilogy. It would just be, like I said, anticlimactic and would undermine the what our heroes had been through and everything the audience had been through. It's like, oh, this again. Um, it wouldn't make any logical sense or any emotional sense. So what's next? Well, if you're taking over Lucasfilm, the first thing, of course, you would have to do is look at George Lucas's story treatments, since he did make story treatments for the sequel trilogy. We don't know, as far as I know, what those treatments consisted of. Um, whether it was just, 2 or 3 page outline, whether it was a 10-page summary or what. But anyone in charge would definitely have to look that over and see what the creator's thoughts are. Um, Now, I wouldn't feel obliged to use that in full. I don't think George Lucas would use it in full, even if he were to turn those into scripts himself. The creative process is a process, and things shift around and change over time as it's going on, as it's developing, and so I wouldn't feel any obligation to use it as is. Um, and still, I'd be focusing on what is the best possible story for a sequel trilogy, according to what makes sense to me. But I would definitely look at his story treatments and find out what I liked about it, and what I didn't, and utilize that accordingly. But since I don't know what the contents are, I can't really comment on it. So moving on. What else we got? For potential stories for stuff after Return of the Jedi. Now, this is where EU fans, expanded universe fans, will say, "Hey, there's already plenty of stories that you can utilize. Look at all these novels and books and comics that take place after Return of the Jedi. Just turn those into movies." And someone will especially point at the Thrawn trilogy and be like, "Just turn those into movies. Those, as far as my own personal headcanon is concerned, those are the sequel trilogy." Um, and no, I like those books, but they would not make. Well, first of all, there would be, or mainly really, there would be the practical, real world issue of the fact that, while I'm pretending this is 2012, it's not 1988. And I say 1988 because the Thrawn trilogy takes place or starts 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi. And 1988 is 5 years after the release of Return of the Jedi. and we can't have our actors play themselves at the age they were then. Just too much time has gone by for them to do that. Um, so it's just, practically it wouldn't work. Um, Plus, there are some story problems with that as well. Primarily, Luke Skywalker, being that Luke in the Thrawn trilogy hasn't begun training new Jedi yet. He hasn't even begun thinking about it. You know, he's wanting to train his sister, of course, and then he's thinking about how he's going to have to train his niece and nephew, and he's worrying about whether he's going to, how well he's going to succeed at that. But that's it. Plus, he's not very, he's in the Thrawn trilogy. Luke is mostly Mara Jade's sidekick. He's not really a leader in those books, and it more or less works in those books. Like I said, I enjoy them. I've read them several times, but it's not the sort of thing you want to see in a sequel trilogy. And given the fact that it wouldn't work anyway, given what we have to work with in the real world, it's not really worth going into any more details of that, unless you wanted to, change the time frame and have the Thrawn events take place, 30 years later, after Return of the Jedi, to make it line up with the ages of Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford and all them. But that would be even worse. It'd be like if you had it take place 30 years after Return of the Jedi and still have Luke not training new Jedi, and still had Luke just being a sidekick to somebody. Yeah, that wouldn't fly at all, right? And if Luke did, had trained a whole new generation of Jedi, that would completely change the dynamic of what Thrawn would have to deal with. So yeah. Moving on. What else we got? Okay. Acknowledging that we have to set this thing about 30 years after Return of the Jedi so that we can use Mark, Carey, Harrison, Billy D. Williams, and all them. What's taking place in the EU at that point? I don't actually know. I haven't read that far. I've only read maybe 25 books of the EU, and some of that took place before Return of the Jedi. But I do know a whole lot of stuff's gone down in that time frame. You've had not only the events of the Thrawn trilogy, but the events of the Jedi Academy trilogy 2-3 years later. You had the Thrawn duology, Hand of Thrawn duology, and of course the entire New Jedi Order series with the Yuuzhan Vong War, which is already done by the time we get 30 years out. And that's a major, major conflict, which is kind of what we need for a sequel trilogy. We need some kind of major political, military conflict for the backdrop. Of course, the most important things ultimately are the characters. If the characters don't work, if the audience doesn't care about the characters, if the audience isn't satisfied with the characters, isn't concerned about them, isn't interested in them, then the whole thing flops. And that goes for pretty much any movie. You want the audience to be to connect with the characters and want to hang out with them and want to see what happens with them. But you still do need that backdrop. And a war like the Yuuzhan Vong War would be a convenient and pretty good way to go with it, I think. But if you were going to do that, you'd have to change the time frame up a little bit. You'd have to move it up and have it take place or start 30 years after Return of the Jedi, which would make the Solo children older. And instead of 16 at the and 15, 16, they'd be around 30. Well, no, they'd actually be around 25 if you kept the rest of the story, the rest of the timeline consistent with Han and Leia getting married 4 years after Return of the Jedi, and then having kids a little soon after that. Personally, I would change that up. I think having Han and Leia wait that long is ridiculous. In my, you know, growing up, I always assumed Han and Leia were going to get married, the day after the celebrations in Ewok Village, like, because that's the way things happen in fairy tale stories like this. And the idea that she would wait and wait, and then get, I think she gets engaged to some other dude for political reasons, and then Han has to use some like stick of command or something like that to get her away. That, yeah, right. It's ridiculous. They're an item. They're get them married and get going. And so that would make their children like 30 years old at this point, 30 years after Return of the Jedi, which would be a different dynamic. They wouldn't have the teen angst, and all the teen concerns, passions, ideals, and what have you. So it'd be a different dynamic, but it could still work, I think. Um, but then you would have the issue, again, the question, would this feel like a natural third act of a trilogy of trilogies? In a way, yes. In a way, no. Because obviously it would be very different from the first two trilogies. It would with the it would be a different look for the um, antagonist. It would be a very different dynamic with the good guys being in charge of the galactic government, and being on the defensive against an outside force, which we haven't seen in Star Wars before. Um, and so it would be a different look. It would be a different conflict. So in that way, it would feel inconsistent. But on the other hand, the prequels looked and felt a little bit different than the original trilogy, but they're still Star Wars. But then again, it was the same through line for the prequels and the original trilogy, and this would be a totally different conflict. So there would be that it being a different conflict would be inconsistent with, but at the same time it would be, oh, it's starting to snow. Okay. It would be a a way for our new heroes and new government to have something fresh to deal with, a fresh threat to deal with, instead of the age-old threat of the Empire and of Sith, which would be weird to have Star Wars without the Sith. And you could still have that. I mean, Force users are people, and with the potential for good or evil, and so they always have the potential to use the Force for good or bad, and to fall to the dark side. So you can always have that in there somewhere. But for that main conflict, you could, have the Yuuzhan Vong. And there are a couple issues with the Yuuzhan Vong that I do have that I want to address in the next video, because I'm going to stop this one here. Okay, see you in the next one.